2024 started in a funny way to me. Usually the first game I complete at the start of the year tends to be a game I was actively looking forward to, personal preference and all that. And yet, I spent the final days of 2023 and the first day of 2024 completing 80s Overdrive, a small indie game inspired by arcade races of old. I was surprised by how much fun I was having with it, up until the very end, where the game threw a cheated opponent against me, almost ruining the experience. Final race aside, this left me realizing I have never truly sat down to play a racing game proper, outside of Horizon Chase Turbo, which I reviewed a few years back, and the usual kart racer that I haven't touched in years. In general, I'm not much of a racing player myself, mainly because when I was younger my experiences with these games were to either crash constantly because I was terrible with the controls, or to steamroll entire races if I played on easy, so I decided it was time to change that and maybe open a new world of possibilities for myself. So what better way to get started than by sorting through my never-ending backlog. Some of these games are old, but I don't think I mind it as long as it helps me get a foot inside this genre. Starting with Burnout Paradise. Couple reasons I went with this. First, because I love the Burnout series, probably the only racing game I played back in the 6th generation, and also because it's the only game in the franchise available on PC, which in itself is a crime because they really don't make them like this anymore. Many hail Paradise as the best in the franchise. Others even lament that this is one it ended on since, aside from a remaster a couple years back, Burnout is just dead. Me, I loved my time with this game. There is just something immersive and cheesy about being on a city where you can start events at any intersection you want, and where you can claim somebody else's car by totaling them.
The Kitano Toge Sport has been delivered to your junkyard.
And of course, the freedom to trash the other competitors and play dirty in order to get ahead. It's all delightful, but it did come with a small catch. There is no fast travel system, so if you lose a race you have to drive all the way back to where you started. The other catch is the iconic takedowns are a bit more limited this time around. Slamming opponents against railcars starts to get a bit old after a while, so in the long run, no pun intended, the experience felt a little more limited than it needed to be. Also, I'm not sure if this is a side effect of the 7th generation trying to capture quote-unquote realism in all their games, but they got rid of the ability to weaponize the traffic around you. I mean, you can still slam opponents against traffic for extra spectacle, but if you bump, crash, or even touch traffic cars at all, well... But despite that, the game is still amazing. It doesn't take too much to drive across the entire city to get back to where you started, and just cruising around hunting for unlockable cars to take down never gets old. It says enough about how much of a fun game this is for a newbie like me when I did end up beating the game, or at least maxing out my license to the point where I got to see the credits. If I ever decide to 100% complete it, it would probably have to be when I get my hands on the remaster. Since I'm under trashing my opponent's car's edge, I wanted to take a look at what I later found out to be the most infamous entry in the Dirt franchise, Dirt Showdown. I went with it mainly because the game has a Demolition Derby theme going on, and I wanted to see how different racing games are across the board. And after going through the entire career mode, I can see why this game is infamous. On the one hand, I love how well this game controls. When it's time to crash into other racers or just straight up playing dirty, this game lets you go crazy. The most fun moments I had are the ones where I spent the first couple laps making my way into first place, or the races where I had to trash my opponents or even have to survive getting trashed as long as possible. On the other hand, this game makes some rather bizarre choices. Like having you do freestyle races, which is just jumping over a ramp or doing donuts. And of course, doing an obstacle course that is essentially just Simon Says. It wouldn't be a problem if this was occasional, but the career mode had multiple instances of these races, and it made me wonder why was I wasting my time doing this, and why there were so few races where I got to have fun playing dirty against my opponents, but also needed to be careful because they can also do it to me. I still had fun with the game though. There is some silly charm about 7th generation games thanks to their tone. They have that angsty teenager vibe, desperate to be taken seriously, with angsty rock and dude bro energies. This is also where I started to grasp the idea of learning better how to handle my car and how to maneuver around my opponents. I really started to feel smart for figuring out the better ways to move around the track and not crash horribly like I used to when I didn't know how to appreciate this genre back then. But maybe the better way to appreciate it will be if I went into something leaning more towards the simulator side of things. Or rather, a simcade? Let me tell you a fun story. Back in 2013 at a cyber cafe, the owner showed me Grid 2. I was captivated by the premise of the career mode. You're a rookie driver looking to make a name for yourself, so no matter how good or bad you do in your first race, you go viral, gain a sponsor, and proceed to spend the following 5 years creating an entire championship series. Awesome and very unusual of a premise, at least for me since I'm new to the genre. I was curious enough that I actually bought both this and the first game, and took the first one for a spin, and ended up regretting it. I failed to realize the first Grid wasn't just a 7th gen game, it was an early 7th gen game at that, meaning the PC version is not very good. Any adjustment I tried to make for the settings simply didn't work, but that should be fine as long as I get to play the game proper, right? Well, I didn't take into consideration that maybe jumping into a simcade where your car gets easily totaled is not a good idea, especially if you're on the keyboard like I am. Like I said, I spent an hour trying to play this. I was not able to finish a single race. Yes, it was my own fault, but it doesn't change the fact that it frustrated me. Since the game has a degree of realism to it, it means that one wrong crash can ruin an entire race by messing up the car enough that it doesn't even turn well. So by the time I ruined an entire final attempt at a race by crashing, I simply called it quits. It was the kind of frustrating session that gave me a headache. So I dropped the game for good and went to the game that I should have tried from the very beginning, the sequel. Grid 2 caught my attention for 2 reasons. For one, the flavor story is about how you're the new racer get into the business and build a reputation by facing off against other famous racers. The second reason, the rewind mechanic. For a newbie like me, the mechanic is perfect. It lets me correct my mistakes, but it also encourages me to avoid making them as much as possible, mainly because you only get 3 rewinds, and after that, you are on your own. It made the game a lot easier to go through at first, but even setting everything to an easier difficulty, the races did end up becoming more challenging the further I progressed, both in the complexity of the tracks and in how tightly together the other competitors are, and how they can overtake you if you are not careful. There was also one more thing I disabled in the options that made this a far more enjoyable experience. All damage to my cars is cosmetic. I know bigger fans of this franchise hate the idea of removing that handicap, but Grid 1 frustrated me enough, so I'd rather be able to learn the game without throwing an entire race because I crashed too hard. Because the races in this game are not short. I mean, they are at first, but the more you progress, the tracks get longer, and the cars get a bit more complex to drive depending on their category. Even if I made the game easier for myself, I still found myself getting stuck in it a few races. And I had to retry with different cars because, as it turns out, every car drives differently. I had to learn when to take curves, when to overtake my opponents. I had to learn to use both the main brake and the handbrake, and also had to learn how to keep control over my car so I didn't wipe out and got lost. In general, this game taught me how to properly drive a car in a racing game. Now, I realize Grid 2 is not the ideal starting point, since the game is more simcade than anything, but maybe that is the sweet spot for me. It helps that I found most of the events very fun to play, from regular races to elimination races where the car going last gets eliminated until one car remains, to one-on-one duels where your driving has to be impeccable if you want to get first place, to even racing in steep curves that forced me to truly learn all the controls. It's funny to say, but I love how in most of the events it takes me at least a lap or 2 to get first place, And that is before taking any crashes or mistakes into account. It made earning that first place all the more delicious, like I actually deserve it. Best part is, I couldn't rest easy. The other racers were constantly onto me, so the challenge was there. Even those moments had its fun. You can crash in very spectacular ways in this game, and so can your opponents. This is where making car damage cosmetic made things more interesting. I could reduce my car to scraps in the most spectacular fashion, and then come out on top looking like I went through quite a battle. Not all of my experience was perfect, of course. There were a few bumps in the road that made me give up on 100% completion, but those were minor once I focused on finishing the events. Also, I felt the game was a bit lengthier than it needed to be. I know not all of these games play the same, and there were probably better choices, but as I said at the beginning, these are the most immediate games I had access to, and if these are the weaker entries in their respective franchises, then I am excited to see what the better options are like. It's things like this that remind me why I love gaming so much. Even if I already got a favorite genre for a franchise of choice I like to default to, sometimes branching out can be even more fun as I get new experiences and expand what I enjoy. I may even take a deeper look into these or other genres now that I got my hands on more recent entries, and who knows, I may even come back here again to share my experience.